This lecture is about joints. A joint is an articulation. An articulation is a site where two or more bones meet. Joints give the skeleton mobility and they hold the skeleton together. There are three classifications of joints. There's fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints. Fibrous joints are basically joints that are composed of fibrous connective tissue. There's no joint cavity. These are the most immovable joints. Example of these type of joints will be the sutures between the cranial bones. They basically are very little movement between these joints, almost as if they're fused. Second type of joint is cartilaginous joints. These are joints that are where bones are united by cartilage. Again, there's no joint cavity, and these joints are not highly movable, but they do move more than the fibrous joints. Some examples would be the epiphyseal plate, where the higher length of the cartilage is inserted between the epiphysis and the diaphysis of the bone. The sternum, where the joint is between the first rib and the sternum, is made of cartilage. The vertebral body are connected through the disc, which is fibrocartilage. So this technically would be a cartilaginous joint. And pubic symphysis is the joint between the two pubic bones. These are connected by cartilage in this area. So again, the cartilaginous joints. The synovial joints are the high-end joints of the body. These are the most advanced joints. These are fluid-filled cavities. They include all the limb joints and most of the joints of the body. We're going to look at the different aspects of the synovial joint. First of all, there's articular cartilage. Articular cartilage means cartilage over the joint. This is usually hyaline cartilage. And we see here on this diagram here is the blue. It's basically it's a surface that is of cartilage that's inserted over the bone and between the bones, so that there's a smoother surface for the bones to slide across each other. The articular cartilage is smoother than the bone itself, so it makes it for easier movement. The joint cavity is space between the bones. Is a closed space made up of ligaments, or bounded by ligaments and articular cartilage. And this cavity is filled with synovial fluid, which acts as a lubricant to make the joint move smoothly. The joint capsule is located here. The capsule is composed of an external fibrous layer and an inner synovial membrane. And this is the capsule here. It surrounds the joint. It produces synovial fluid, which is a fluid that's highly viscous and acts as a lubricant. And all these are features that make the joint easily movable. Synovial fluid is like WD-40. It lubricates and it lets the joint move smoother. The reinforcing ligaments on a synovial joint. Ligaments, like in this case of the knee, ligaments that bridge from one bone to the next, for added support. This just gives greater support to the joint. There's nerve and blood vessels in the joint. Now, similar to the synovial fluid in the joint, there's bursa and tendon sheaths. A bursa is a sac filled with synovial fluid that is placed in an area where ligaments, muscles, tendons, and bones rub together. It acts as a lubricant where there's moving parts. Makes those parts move smooth with less friction. A tendon sheath is an elongated bursa wrapped around a tendon that lets the tendon move back and forth without much friction. Here's a picture of a bursa, the subacromial bursa. Here's this as his arm abducts. This is the humerus in the glenoid cavity. His arm swings out, and there's movement in here. This bursa prevents the joint from sticking, and ensures a smoother movement. The tendon sheath here is surrounded by, for example, this is the tendon to the long head of the bicep. So when the biceps contracts and that tendon is moving back and forth, it's not rubbing against bone. It's enclosed in this tendon sheath, which basically acts like a sac for a lubricant to make the tendon move more smoothly. There's some particular movements that these joints allow. We talk about movements of the limbs. Different categories of movement. There's non-axial movement, which when you think of an axis, you think of something rotating. An axis is rotational. So non-axial movement would be sliding movements, almost no rotation. Uniaxial movement would be movement in one plane. An example of this would be the hinges on a cabinet door. It's one plane of movement. Biaxial was movement in two planes. So two areas of motion. Multiaxial is movement around all three planes. So there's greater degrees of freedom around a multiaxial joint than the other joints. There's general types of movements at synovial joints, including gliding movements, which are just sliding one bone over the other. Angular movements, which includes flexion, extension, hyperextension, abduction, adduction, circumduction, where there's rotational movements, which includes medial and lateral rotation. An example of gliding movements is what happens between the bones of the wrist and bones of the ankle. These bones have flat surfaces, and they simply glide or slide over each other. Flat surface slides over each other. There's no axis, no rotation around an axis. It's just sliding movements only. Here's an example of gliding movements. Now, since there's so many bones at the wrist, 8 bones at the wrist, there's a potential for quite a bit of movement. As you see, this hand can have fairly high degree of movement with just sliding or gliding movements. Flexion, by definition, is a decrease in the angle of a joint. Extension is when the angle of the joint is increased. Hyperextension is when the joint is extended beyond the normal anatomical position. So here's an example of flexion of the neck. Flexion bending forward, extension bending backward. Hyperextension is extending back beyond the normal movement. Here's hyperextension of the knee, the normal knee. And in this case, genu recurvatum is when the knee is hyperextended. Here we have flexion at the waist, extension at the waist, and hyperextension at the waist. Here we have flexion of the shoulder, where the arm goes forward is flexion. When the arm goes back to neutral is extension, and hyperextension is when the arm goes back further behind. The knee is flexed in this case. Again, the angle of the joint decreases. When the leg is straight out, it's a 180-degree angle, and when it's bent at 9 degrees, you have a decrease in the angle of the joint, so therefore it's considered flexion. Extension is when the angle of the joint increases back to the 180 degrees, so extension of the joint. Abduction of the limb is when the limb moves away from midline. Adduction is moving toward the midline. Think of abduction as if a child is abducted, they're taken away from their family. So abduction means moving away from the midline. Adduction is add it back to the midline, add it back to the body, so moving towards the body. Circumduction involves flexion, abduction, extension, and adduction of the limb, and the limb describes a cone in space. If the tip of the cone, the point of the cone is the shoulder, and then the movement of the hand is the base of the cone. This illustrates. There's circumduction. Think of the point of the cone being the shoulder, and then this would be the base of the cone. There's movement in different planes. There's flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, all by rotation of this shoulder in the joint here. This is because this is a ball and socket joint, so there's more degrees of freedom of movement with this type of joint. And here's abduction, adduction. Abduction is taking the arm away. Adduction is bringing the arm back. Rotation is turning of bone around its own long axis. For example, medial and lateral rotation of the shoulder. You also have rotation between the first and second vertebral body. Rotation of the humerus and the femur can occur as well. Here we have the rotation of that about the cervical. This is C1, C2. This is, she's shaking her head no, so this allows this from rotation from C1 over C2. The hip can rotate laterally or medially. Same thing can happen in the shoulder as well. Protraction is a forward movement of the shoulder. Retraction is backward movement of the mandible, not shoulder, but mandible. Protraction is a forward movement of the mandible. Retraction is a backward movement of the mandible. Elevation is just raising up of the in this case of the mandible. Depression is lowering of the mandible. You have elevation and depression of other structures as well, like the scapula. Pronation and supination. Pronation is when the hand is out in front with the palm up, is supination. If you rotate it so the palm is facing down, it's pronation. Think of supination as if you're holding a bowl of soup with the palm up. Pronation, palm down. The thumb movement, you have adduction, bring the thumb back towards the hand. Abduction is bring the thumb away from the hand. Abduction of the thumb. There's flexion and extension of the thumb as well. Flexion is when the thumb is bent over towards the little finger. Extension is when the thumb is brought away from the little finger. Opposition of the thumb is when the thumb rotates and flexes over to touch the tip of the thumb to the tip of the little finger. This is the opposition of the thumb. This is what it means by having opposable thumbs. Far side cartoon here. There it goes again. Here we sit without opposable thumbs. Dorsiflexion pertains to the movement of the ankle. Dorsiflexion is bringing the ankle up. Plantar flexion is pointing the ankle down, like stepping on the tiptoes. This dorsiflexion is up. Plantar flexion is down. Inversion and eversion apply to the feet only. Inversion is bending the foot in this direction so that the sole of the foot is pointed medially. Eversion is such that when the sole of the foot is pointing laterally. Look at the 6 types of synovial joints. And these are all synovial joints. There's plane joints. This is the gliding type joints that we saw on the wrist, and especially sliding of one flat surface over another flat surface. You see this in the carpal bones, the tarsal bones, and the joints between the vertebral facet joints. A hinge joint is a uniaxial movement, just like the hinge of a cabinet door just rotates in one direction. Hinge, think of the hinge as rotating around a single axis. Flexion and extension would be an example of this. So the elbow joint, flexion and extension of the elbow, flexion and extension of the interphalangeal joints. These are joints between the phalanges of the fingers. They move at only one axis. Pivot joints are just one axis of movement. There's uniaxial movement, but these, in this case, the bone rotates around this axis here. So it's just one axis. Example of this would be the radio-ulnar joint, which lets you pronate and supinate your forearm, and the atlantoaxial joint. This is the joint between the atlas and the axis. Atlantoaxial joint. Condylar joint involves biaxial movement. This is when there's oval surface on both bones. Remember we talked earlier that when you see the word condyle, referring to joint, this is what a condyle is. It's a round circular surface. This is seen in many joints. We saw that in the occipital condyle, from the occipital bone articulating with C1 vertebral body. We've seen the mandibular condyle, where the mandible articulates with the temporal bone in the TMJ joint. But this type of movement allows for flexion and extension and abduction and adduction. So therefore there's two planes of motion, flexion, extension, and abduction and adduction. Therefore it's biaxial movement, because it allows movement in two planes. Here's an example of some condyles. There's a saddle joint, which also is biaxial movement. This looks like a saddle, and the rider sitting on the saddle, and it allows for abduction and adduction, and also for flexion and extension. This is seen in the carpometacarpal joint of the thumb. So it's the joint here where the thumb, the first metacarpal bone articulates with the wrist. So this is the base of the thumb. Notice it's not the joint where the thumb connects to the hand. It's the joint where the hand, the hand metacarpal bone of the hand articulates with the carpal bone. That's why it's called carpometacarpal bone joint. Carpo means wrist, metacarpal means hand. So it's joint between the wrist and the hand of the first digit, the thumb. And then the ball and socket joint is the final type of joint. This is a multi-axial joint because it moves in at least three planes of motion: flexion and extension, adduction and abduction, as well as rotation. So three different types of movement are present in this joint. This is a ball and socket joint. And the two ball and socket joints are the shoulder, where the humerus articulates with the glenoid cavity, and also in the hip joint. Look at some joint injuries, joint abnormalities. You've heard of a sprained ankle. A sprain, the definition of a sprain is when a ligament that surrounds a joint is stretched or torn. Sprains heal slowly because ligaments are poorly vascularized. That's why a sprained ankle takes longer to heal than a broken ankle. But a sprain is an injury to ligament. A strain, on the other hand, is an injury to a muscle. Muscle strain, ligament sprain. Dislocation is when the bones are forced out of alignment. Here's an example of the dislocation of the elbow. once a joint is dislocated, it's easier to dislocate the joint again because by the first dislocation stretches the capsule and the ligaments, making it easier for it to dislocate repeatedly. Bursitis is inflammation of a bursa. Here's an example of a bursa over the tip of the elbow called the olecranon bursa. This is an olecranon bursitis, or student's elbow. This comes from having your elbow propped up on the table for a long time, and just causes inflammation of that bursa, leading to a very painful, swollen, fluid-filled lesion on the elbow. Tendonitis is inflammation of a tendon sheath. This is usually overuse of the tendon moving back and forth in the tendon sheath can cause friction and can develop degeneration and inflammation, and that's called tendonitis. Arthritis is inflammation or degenerative disease of a joint. Arthritis results in pain, stiffness, and swelling of joints. It's commonly seen in the hands and fingers, commonly seen in the hips and the joints of the back as well. That's an overview of joints.